"Excuse me, sir. Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" The words cut sharply through the steady hum of boarding passengers. A flight attendant stood at the front, her eyes narrowing on a tall black man who had just stepped onto the plane. Her tone was sweet on the surface, but laced with something colder, something meant to sting. The man paused in the aisle, meeting her gaze with calm eyes. He adjusted the strap of his carry-on, his voice steady. "Yes, I know where I'm supposed to be." But she didn't stop. Her smirk widened as she let her voice carry just a little louder, so nearby passengers could hear. "Well, I guess anything goes these days. Didn't realize we let people board dressed like that." A couple of heads turned. A woman halfway down the aisle frowned, but quickly looked away, while another passenger pretended to scroll on his phone. The tension was immediate, like static before a storm, hanging in the narrow cabin. The man said nothing, slipping past her with quiet dignity. He walked toward his row, his calm footsteps almost defiant in their silence. But the attendant wasn't finished. "Premium cabin seats aren't exactly casual," she added with a laugh, feigning politeness. "Are you sure this isn't a mistake?" Gasps and whispers trickled through the crowd. One passenger shifted uncomfortably, murmuring, "That's not right," but fell silent when no one else spoke up. The man lowered himself into his seat, set his bag beneath him, and folded his hands. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of seatbelts clicking and overhead bins slamming shut. Yet everyone nearby had heard her words. "Someone like you." That phrase lingered in the air, heavier than the recycled cabin air itself. Passengers exchanged glances, torn between outrage and silence. No one wanted to confront a flight attendant before takeoff. No one wanted to risk being the next target. But the man's silence spoke volumes. He sat tall, collected, as though he knew something no one else did, something that made him immune to her insults. And as the cabin door closed and the engines began to rumble, a single question gripped the uneasy passengers. Why was he staying so calm? And what would happen when his patience finally ran out? The seatbelt light had not even flickered on, yet the tension inside the cabin was already unbearable. Passengers tried to settle in, but every ear remained tuned to the front, where the flight attendant still lingered, her voice dripping with condescension. "Some people really think money buys class," she muttered, just loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. Her words were coated in false sweetness, but the sneer beneath them was unmistakable. A man across the aisle raised his eyebrows, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His wife gave him a quick shake of the head, silently warning, "Don't get involved." Others ducked their gazes, choosing to bury themselves in their screens, as if avoiding eye contact could erase what they'd just witnessed. The black man, however, sat perfectly still. His posture was straight, his eyes fixed ahead. Not a flicker of anger, not a single word in response. The contrast was striking. The louder she became, the quieter he grew. But she wasn't finished. While pouring drinks into plastic cups, she made sure her comments carried just far enough. "Imagine thinking you belong here when you clearly don't." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A teenager whispered, "That's so wrong." His mother quickly hushed him, pulling his earbuds back into place. The fear of confrontation was stronger than their outrage. Still, the man's calm composure unsettled everyone more than the insults themselves. His silence was unnerving, most deliberate. It was as though he knew something no one else did, and that secret weighed heavier than any cruel remark could. The attendant glanced back toward him, expecting a reaction. When none came, her smirk faltered for a moment before she turned sharply on her heel. For the first time, her confidence looked fragile. Around him, passengers shifted again, stealing quick glances at the man as if asking silently, "Why doesn't he fight back? Why does he look so unshaken?" They didn't know it yet, but the answer would shatter the false calm of this flight. because silence, in his hands, wasn't weakness. It was power, waiting for the right moment to strike. The plane climbed smoothly into the clouds, but inside the cabin the air felt heavy. Conversations dimmed, as though every passenger sensed they were watching something unfold that shouldn't be ignored. The flight attendant returned to the aisle, tray in hand, her eyes darting toward the black man with a flicker of disdain. She leaned close to another passenger, whispering just loud enough, "Some people don't really belong up here. You can always tell." The words were meant to sting, and they did. The man didn't flinch, didn't speak. He sat steady in his seat, his gaze forward, as though the comments were nothing but turbulence passing by. His silence only seemed to provoke her further. When she reached his row, she placed the drink cart with an exaggerated thud. "Can I help you, sir? Or is this too fancy for your taste?" Her tone was sharp, her smile forced. He looked at her calmly. "Water will be fine." Her eyes narrowed. "Just water? I would have guessed something cheaper." A few passengers gasped softly. One man across the aisle shifted, leaning forward as if ready to speak up, then leaned back, fear winning over courage. As she handed him the cup, she deliberately held it just out of reach, forcing him to extend his arm further. It was a small gesture, but everyone watching knew it was intentional. Whispers rippled through the rows. Why is she treating him like this? Why isn't anyone stopping her? Later, she circled back again, glancing at his ticket stub tucked by the seat pocket. "Are you sure you're in the right place? These are premium seats. Mistakes happen, you know." His reply was calm, almost chilling in its composure. "I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." Passengers exchanged looks, their unease growing into outrage they didn't quite dare voice. A woman muttered to her husband, "This isn't right." He nodded, jaw tight, but kept his eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. The attendant, oblivious or unwilling to stop, straightened her uniform with pride. She thought she was in control, unaware that every cruel word was pushing the cabin closer to a breaking point. And as the man remained silent, unwavering, a question hung thick in the recycled air. How much longer would this go on? Before someone finally stepped in, or before he revealed why he endured it all. The moment came like a crack of thunder. The flight attendant stopped in the aisle, eyes fixed on the man with an expression that mixed irritation with triumph. She drew in a sharp breath, then let the words spill out loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "You don't belong here. This is a premium cabin. People like you don't usually sit up front." The silence that followed was deafening. A child gasped. A woman in the row ahead turned in disbelief. Even the steady hum of the engines seemed swallowed by the weight of her accusation. The man finally looked up, his calm gaze locking with hers. For the first time he let the silence stretch, forcing her to squirm under his steady eyes. Passengers leaned closer, anticipation thick as fog. A voice from the back whispered, "She didn't just say that, did she?" Another answered, "Oh, she did." The attendant crossed her arms, doubling down. "If you can't show the proper ticket, I'll have to move you. We can't have confusion in that section." That was it, the final straw. The man's voice, firm and resonant, cut through the cabin like steel. "Enough!" It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The single word commanded more authority than her tirade ever could. Passengers straightened in their seats, startled by the shift. His tone carried calm power, the kind that silenced every whisper. "You've questioned me, humiliated me, and judged me without cause. But before you take another step, you should ask yourself one thing." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. "Do you really know who you're talking to?" The attendant's smirk faltered, her confidence flickering like a candle in the wind. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. everyone waiting, desperate to know what he meant. The man's composure had not cracked, yet something in his words promised that the storm was far from over. And as the stunned silence spread through the rows, the passengers realized the truth he was about to reveal would change everything. The tension inside the cabin was so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Every passenger was frozen, eyes darting between the flight attendant and the man she had belittled since boarding. And then he spoke, calm, measured, but with a weight that carried through every corner of the aircraft. You've made assumptions about me from the moment I stepped onto this plane. You've questioned my right to sit here, mocked me in front of others, and treated me as if I didn't belong. His gaze was steady, his voice unwavering. But there's one thing you never considered. I'm not just another passenger. I am a federal air marshal, and I'm on duty on this flight. The words hit like a lightning strike. Gasps erupted across the cabin. A man in the back muttered, "He's an air marshal." A woman clutched her chest, whispering, "Oh my God." The attendant's smug grin evaporated instantly. Her face drained of color as she stumbled back a step, the tray in her hand rattling from her sudden loss of composure. He continued, his voice, calm but carrying an edge of authority that silenced every sound but his own. My job is to protect every soul on this aircraft. And yet, the greatest disturbance tonight hasn't come from a threat outside. It's come from the very person meant to serve and reassure these passengers. Murmurs swelled, growing into open whispers of outrage. She treated him like dirt. Unbelievable. She should be ashamed. Heads nodded throughout the rows, passengers who had once stayed silent, now emboldened by his revelation. The attendant's eyes darted nervously, searching for an escape. Her earlier confidence shattered beyond repair. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. I didn't know. The man leaned back in his seat, his composure unbroken. You didn't care to know. That was the problem. The cabin erupted, not in chaos but in applause. It wasn't loud or raucous, but steady, heartfelt, a ripple of respect traveling through the rows. Passengers looked at him differently now, not just as a victim of cruelty, but as a protector sitting silently among them. The flight attendant, humiliated and trembling, had no defense left. And as the applause slowly faded, every person on board understood. The balance of power had shifted, and this flight would never feel the same again. But this was only the beginning of the reckoning she was about to face. The applause faded into a heavy silence, but the weight of the moment lingered like thunderclouds refusing to drift away. All eyes were still locked on the man who had just revealed his true identity. For the first time since the plane left the ground, he leaned forward, speaking not just to the attendant, but to everyone within earshot. I remained silent, he began, his voice calm, deliberate, because escalation at 30,000 feet can create panic. Panic is dangerous in the air, but there comes a point when silence allows injustice to thrive, and that point has been crossed. Gasps and nods rippled across the rows. His words carried more than authority. They carried truth. The attendant who had mocked him stood frozen, her once smug confidence now crumbling into fragments of shame. Another flight attendant hurried down the aisle, whispering urgently, "Sir, please, let's not disturb the passengers further." But the passengers themselves pushed back, their voices rising in solidarity. "He's not disturbing anyone," one man snapped. "She was the one causing problems." Another woman added, "We all saw what happened." The first attendant's eyes widened as she realized the tide had shifted. The crew wasn't defending her anymore. The passengers weren't looking away. Every stare was now aimed at her, sharp as judgment. The air marshal straightened in his seat, his calm presence radiating control. "I don't need an apology for myself," he said evenly. "But these passengers deserve respect. They deserve to feel safe, not subjected to prejudice disguised as authority. His words landed like stone. The lead steward, pale-faced, finally approached, placing a firm hand on the offending attendant's shoulder. "That's enough," he said in a clipped tone. "You will step aside for the remainder of this flight." Murmurs of approval spread quickly, some passengers even clapping again, not out of spectacle this time, but out of relief, as if justice had finally pierced through the cabin's uneasy air. The attendant's shoulders slumped, her arrogance shattered in front of the very people she had tried to impress. She retreated, leaving behind only the echo of her humiliation. The air marshal leaned back, serene once more. He had turned the tide without anger, without shouting, just with truth and composure. And in that moment, every person on board understood. The power in this cabin had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. But what they didn't know yet was that the lesson was far from over. The roar of the engines filled the cabin, but for the first time ceased. Inst takeoff. The air inside felt lighter. The outburst, the humiliation, the revelation, all of it had settled into a silence now charged with something different. Respect. Passengers who had avoided eye contact earlier now turned toward the man with nods of acknowledgement. A woman across the aisle leaned slightly forward, her voice soft but sincere. "I'm sorry for not saying something sooner. You didn't deserve that." He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You did what you thought was best in the moment. That's human." Further down, a young man spoke up, his tone uneasy. "I wanted to say something, but I froze. I guess I was afraid." The air marshal met his gaze, calm as ever. Courage doesn't always mean speaking first. Sometimes it means reflecting, learning, and being ready the next time. Whispers of agreement rippled through the rows. The shame passengers had felt earlier began to transform into quiet resolve. Each of them had witnessed prejudice in its rawest form, and each was left to reckon with their silence. Meanwhile, the disgraced attendant sat rigid in the jump seat at the back, her hands clenched tight. Her eyes darted across the cabin, but no one met them now. The authority she had once wielded so carelessly was gone. In its place stood the heavy weight of consequence. Another crew member approached the air marshal, this time with genuine respect. "Sir, thank you for your patience. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." He gave a brief nod. "It's not about me. It's about remembering that every person who boards this plane deserves dignity. You never know who they are, what they carry, or the role they play." The words lingered like a final lesson, sinking into the hearts of those around him. Passengers sat a little straighter, as though silently promising themselves to never stay quiet in the face of cruelty again. And as the plane soared higher through the night sky, one truth became undeniable. Respect isn't earned through uniforms or positions. It's a right owed to every human being. The flight wasn't just continuing, it was carrying with it a lesson none of them would ever forget. The wheels of the aircraft touched down with a heavy thud, the runway lights streaking past like stars on Earth. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was nothing like when the journey began. What started as whispers of humiliation had transformed into silence, filled with reflection. As the seatbelt sign chimed, passengers exchanged glances, some with guilt, some with newfound respect. A woman leaned toward her husband, her voice trembling. "We witnessed more than a flight today. We witnessed a lesson." The air marshal remained seated, calm as ever, his presence steady. He hadn't needed anger, nor raised fists to command respect. His quiet strength had been enough to turn cruelty into shame, and silence into applause. The disgraced attendant avoided every eye, her earlier arrogance replaced with regret she could no longer disguise. For her, the landing wasn't just the end of a journey. It was the beginning of accountability. As the doors opened and passengers began to file out, several paused near the man's seat. Small gestures spoke volumes, A nod, a whispered, "Thank you," even a hand over the heart. Each one carried the same unspoken truth. We should have stood with you sooner. And then, as the final passengers stepped onto the jet bridge, the narration shifts to us, the audience. Because this story doesn't just belong in the cabin of one plane, it belongs to all of us. Every day, people are judged by appearances, mocked for who they are, or dismissed before they're known. And every day, each of us has the choice: remain silent, or stand for what is right. Respect and dignity cost nothing, yet they carry the power to change everything. So the question is simple. When the moment comes, which choice will you make?